Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to get started in just 1 minute. People coming in. Happy, glorious, sunny Friday to everyone. Let's get started. So thanks, everyone, for joining us for today's webinar, which is the Opportunity in Modernizing Vermont's Renewable Energy Standard. I'm Johanna Miller, Energy and Climate Program Director at the Vermont Natural Resources Council. We're happy to host today's webinar in conversation with our partners at the Conservation Law Foundation, VPIRG, the Vermont chapter of the Sierra Club, Vermont Businesses for Social Responsibility, and Vermont Conservation Voters. I'm just going to do a quick agenda review. So we're going to start today's webinar with a little bit of context from me, which is likely a refresher for many of you. Then we're going to turn it over to VPIRG's Climate and Energy Program Director, Ben Edgerly-Walsh, who's going to sort of frame it up related to where we've been when it comes to requiring our electric utilities portfolios to be increasingly renewable and what changes we're hoping to see and we anticipate at this point to the best of our ability, focused on making our electric sector cleaner sooner. So, and I just want to note that Ben is about as dedicated of a climate champ as they come. Working for a habitable, healthy planet. He's beaming in from afar for this conversation, despite being down with COVID. So Ben, huge gratitude for you, not only today, but in so many ways. After that, I'm going to turn it over to Chase Whiting, who's a staff attorney on the Clean Energy and Climate team at the Conservation Law Foundation. Chase is going to get into more details and offer a critical and informed perspective on why this effort is so important. After that, we're going to have time for a Q&A, so please drop your questions in the chat as they arise. We'll aim to get to as many of them as possible. And just, before I turn it over to Ben, I just wanted to offer a little bit of context. Again, likely just a reminder for many of you. I'm just going to try and move my screen forward, which is sort of where we've been in terms of the last year. So a little bit of background. Last year in the legislative session, S112 of 2023 created the Legislative Working Group on a Renewable Energy Standard reform, led by 2 members of each of the House and the Senate, with stakeholders, including reps from the environmental community, Chase and Ben, Brian Shoup from the Vermont Natural Resources Council, included utilities, the business community, low-income advocates. They held 8 meetings to draft legislation to be considered by the General Assembly. Lots of good work, real promising progress, still issues unresolved. That working group was charged with reporting on 8 broad topics, including identifying any barriers to moving to 100% renewable for all electric utilities by 2030, which was a core goal of many, including us. The working group met for the last time this past Wednesday. Again, much exciting progress. There's potential addendums to the final report that have been invited. Probably some anticipated, to be determined, so stay tuned. It's lots of progress, maybe a little bit more, and again, lots more work to do in general. So why do we need res reform? I think there's plenty of reasons. Here are a few related to why we think this matters for us. Economic development, building Vermont's clean energy economy, creating well-paying jobs in state for Vermonters to put food on their table. Environmental justice, not just in someone else's backyard, really sort of bringing our clean energy needs here back home, and also providing opportunities for everyone to participate in the clean energy transition. Energy security and independence, a more local renewable resource supply creates a lot more security. And then climate action. This is all, we need to electrify a lot so that our electric grid and our portfolio needs to be as clean as possible. And again, we have to do our part on climate. So just underscoring the need as we move to electrify our building and transportation sector in particular. On this slide, I'm sure many of you have seen it many a time, sort of gives you a sense. In the green, our transportation emissions, in the orange, our thermal, our building sector emissions. 70% of our emissions in the state of Vermont come from those 2 sectors. We have a huge opportunity and obligation to reduce pollution in those sectors, and electrification will be and should be, must be a leading strategy in that. So we need a clean and green electric portfolio to make climate progress and do our part when it comes to combating the crisis. So, and it's a huge economic opportunity. I think many of us know that, but just to underscore, based on the good work that our friends at the Energy Action Network, that, electricity is far more cost effective than relying on imported dirty fossil fuels. So, as this slide shows, about 75% of the dollars that we collectively spend on electricity stay in the state, as opposed to our spending on fossil fuels, where about 76% of those dollars are exported out of our economy, which does not make good economic sense. So relying on the electric sector, a clean electric sector, is really pivotal for a variety of reasons. So I wanted to just sort of frame out a little bit of that for you. And I'm going to turn it over to Ben in just one moment to give us a sense of, what we're doing today related to renewable energy sector and what we hope to deliver in an updated, modernized renewable energy standard this coming session with your help. So Ben, frame it up where we are and where we're going, and then Chase, I'll leave it to you to get into the details and we'll get into Q&A. So please continue to drop your questions in the chat. Ben, take it away.
Thanks so much, Joey. So before we get into the nitty-gritty of what may be happening this coming legislative session, wanted to give a little bit of the history, backstory around the Renewable Energy Standard, where it stands today, and at a very high level, I'll touch on the direction we may be going, with leaving some of the details to Chase, as Joey mentioned. So I think it's just important to understand. Renewable energy standards have been around since early 90s in the United States. To the best of my knowledge, the first time there was a really concerted effort to pass one in Vermont was in the mid 2000s. That didn't happen. There was a law that was passed that got some renewables built in Vermont, but really was looking to ratepayers in other states to help subsidize those. Actually, the very first campaign that I ever worked on, running VPIRG's climate program, in 2012, was an attempted and very nearly successful passage of a renewable portfolio standard. And then in 2015, we finally got it done. So what you see in front of you is what was included in the law that passed in 2015, which is weirdly now almost a decade ago. And that's a long time when you're talking about renewables and what's really possible with renewable energy technology. So the current renewable portfolio standard, the Renewable Energy Standard is what it's called in Vermont, the RES, you may hear people use to describe it, is 75% total renewable electricity by 2032 as a requirement for, on electric utilities and what they're providing their customers. 10% of that 75% needs to be from new renewable electricity. And the way that's constructed in Vermont is it needs to be from new renewables that are relatively small, less than 5 megawatts, built here in Vermont. And that's by 2032. So it's sort of ramping up from 2017 when it was initially implemented through 2032. So now we're in the sort of low single digits in terms of that requirement. So it is, I think, important to understand that at the time in 2015, that was actually either the highest or one of the highest requirements for distributed renewable generation. From our perspective, there's a real value in having a variety of types and sizes of renewables, having some, that we're getting from the broader region, some in state, some small, some larger. And this requirement that really was for small renewables in Vermont actually was leading edge at the time. The other thing that really was groundbreaking that was done in 2015 was the inclusion of what in Vermont is called Tier 3, the energy transformation tier. And what that says is electric utilities, you now have a legal obligation to help your customers, your ratepayers, reduce their fossil fuel use in other sectors. So if you've seen, an electric vehicle incentive or a heat pump incentive from an electric utility in Vermont, chances are overwhelming that that is a incentive that they're putting on the table to meet their legal obligation under Tier 3 of the Renewable Energy Standard. that is not something that was ever included in any other renewable energy standard at the time. And I'm really proud that Vermont included that because it has provided a lot of important support for Vermonters moving away from fossil fuels in the heating and transportation sectors, which, as Joey noted, are sectors that we really have yet to fully tackle. That all being said, I also want to be abundantly clear that, as I noted, this was a law that was passed almost a decade ago, and that is eons when it comes to renewables. Many states have updated their renewable energy standards since then, and we really are lagging far behind the rest of New England when it comes to the requirements on our electric utilities and to provide renewable energy to Vermonters. Joey, can you move the slide up? Actually, I'm jumping the gun on that. Keep that last one up, but I will just say one other thing before I talk about what might be coming this coming legislative session. This is something that we recognized years ago, like the need to update the renewable energy standard. In 2020, we actually pushed very hard for an update to the renewable portfolio standard that would have doubled that 10% new renewables in Vermont requirement to 20% by 2032. That you may remember also is the year that COVID first hit the world. So we had moved it out of its first committee, and it was needed to get out of a second committee literally on the Friday before the legislature shut down due to COVID. And that, was sort of all she wrote on that one. We did pass the Global Warming Solutions Act that year, but that really was where all of our time and attention went, and other policies, including, unfortunately, the Renewable Portfolio Standard, did not wind up moving that legislative session. So yes, thanks, Joey. Let's just talk very briefly, and I know Chase is going to get into more details on this, where we think we are going to be able to get to this coming legislative session. What we're talking about is getting far more renewables, new renewables online. It is really, really important to understand that the only way to reduce, in terms of electric generation, the only way to reduce carbon pollution, greenhouse gas emissions in the electric sector, when you're talking about generation, is by getting new renewables online. If you are signing a contract, a new contract for renewables that already exist somewhere that someone else is already using, you are not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's the point that we've been making over and over again to anyone who will listen for years. And the Department of Public Service, to their credit, finally working with a consultant, this over the course of the working group Joey mentioned, came forward with data that very clearly demonstrated if you are bringing new renewables online, you're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. If you are not reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And that is really why this whole push is constructed around more requirements, higher requirements for new renewables. So we're looking to get 100% total renewable electricity from renewables by 2032, with big increases to the requirements for new renewables, doubling that in-state number by the early 2030s, also requiring a lot more new renewables from anywhere in the region. Could be Vermont, could be elsewhere in the region, but have to come from new renewables. And those could be from much larger renewable sources, like offshore wind, for instance, could play a meaningful role in that. So I want to be clear, and I'm going to turn it over in just a moment to Chase to talk in more detail, but I want to be clear, what we're pushing for and what actually happens in the legislative session are not always the same. We are feeling very optimistic about this, but we're going to need your help to continue calling on legislators to take this kind of action. But what I can tell you is we are pushing for at least 40% plus new renewables by 2035, and for continued increases in the requirements after that. That as we are growing load, as people are buying more EVs, electrifying more homes with heat pumps, and electric usage is increasing and should be increasing at quite a decent pace in the 2030s, that new requirement come from new renewables, so that utilities aren't doing things that are causing new fossil fuels to come online as we're electrifying our other sectors. The last thing I would say, some things that are not going to be in this, we are very confident are going to push very hard for this to not include nuclear power. That's something some states are doing, shifting from a renewable energy standard to something that includes things that aren't renewable, that no new biomass or new large hydro would be counted towards the numbers that I was talking about. So if we see this move forward, and again, we're going to be pushing hard, we're very optimistic, this would be a real sea change. Talking about hundreds and hundreds, thousands, probably additional megawatts of renewables coming online that would not come online if this law is not updated. So I'm proud of the work that we've done. I am very much looking forward to getting this done this coming legislative session, which shockingly starts in just a few weeks. I'm looking forward to working with all of you on that.
Thanks, Ben. And Chase, it'd be great to hear a little bit more detail from you on sort of the view of the landscape, what we hope to see, why that is important, and then we can talk a little bit more with you all, trying to answer a little bit more questions. But I think Chase can get into some of the details. So take it away, Chase. Thanks.
Thanks, Joey. And thanks, Ben, for being here to lay all of that out so clearly. Even when you have COVID, it's actually kind of inspiring how lucid you remain, even when you're sick.
Chase, sorry to interrupt you. Do you want me to take this down, or do you want? I can
You can take that down. Yeah. I'm just going to sort of speak right now. I don't have a slide to present. So yeah, please feel free to take that down. Thanks. So I'm going to start by talking about some higher level sort of reasons about why a reform for the Renewable Energy Standard matters as part of our overall efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and also in this moment. And then sort of some high level policy points that we've been pushing for. And then I'll drill down a little bit into those tiers that Ben and Joey spoke about, tiers 1, 2, and 3, with the addition of a new tier that we are referring to as tier 1A. So at a high level, why do we need res reform? The Renewable Energy Standard, or really clean renewables, are the linchpin to making all of our climate policies that we're contemplating in the thermal sector, in the transportation sector, and in the electricity sector. It's the linchpin to making all of those work in actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So more concretely, if we're going to power electric vehicles, we need to power them with clean renewables, because if we're powering them with dirty generation sources, those electric vehicles are contributing to greenhouse gas emissions rather than zeroing out or nearly zeroing out emissions from the transportation space. The same is true with our thermal sector. We want to encourage transitions to electric heat pumps to heat and cool our homes, but those are only as clean as the electricity they're operating on. And so in this way, the Renewable Energy Standard and reforming it to become as clean and renewable as possible really is sort of the base upon which those other policies will rely. So to clean up our buildings, to clean up our transportation, we have to get Renewable Energy Standard and reform of our res right. This is compounded because we anticipate that with more electric vehicles and more heat pumps coming online, has been forecasted to occur, we're going to need even more electricity than we currently use. Even implementing efficiencies to reduce the amount of electricity that we would use in existing appliances, or to create ever more efficient electric vehicles or ever more efficient heat pumps, we're still going to see load growth. We're going to need more and more electricity. And so it's going to be really critical that we meet all of that load growth with clean renewable energies, so that we're running our economy, our homes, our transportation, our businesses on that clean electricity. So how do we make that work? We need to grow the amount of new clean renewables. We need as many new renewables in the system as possible. That's not just a goal, but it's actually sort of the reason, or rather the way in which we reduce greenhouse gas emissions. As Ben said, you can only reduce greenhouse gas emissions by bringing on new renewables. And sort of the reason why that is new renewables will displace fossil fuels that are currently creating electricity. So when we bring on more wind, more solar, that's pushing out natural gas, coal, oil, electricity generation. And by bringing more and more of it onto the system, therefore, we're pushing more and more of those fossil fuels out, and we're cleaning up the overall grid upon which heat pumps, electric vehicles, and everything else relies. So growing new renewables is sort of the North Star. We need more and more of them. Now, that doesn't mean that existing renewables just, get short shrift. We need to keep those online too. The good work that we've done in bringing renewables online needs to be credited. And so new renewables will remain, and they will have a place in the Renewable Energy Standard in Tier 1 specifically. But moving forward, we're going to put more and more emphasis and focus on bringing new clean renewables into the Renewable Energy Standard. So existing renewables, they have a place. New renewables, they have a tremendous role to play too. And has been noted, no new electricity from dams that cause new flooding. So, for example, if Hydro-Quebec were to flood a forest with a new dam, that would not qualify. So no new flooding. Nor would we allow any new electricity generated from a new wood biomass facility or an expanded biomass facility. And the reasons there are because of air pollution and because of the greenhouse gases emitted from those equipment, those generation sources. And also has been noted, no nuclear power. So really placing an emphasis on new renewables coming from clean sources that do not emit greenhouse gases, that do not emit air pollutants, and that really do produce clean electricity, things like wind and solar. So that's the high level. That's sort of like what we're shooting for. That's the why. That's why we're doing it. So I'm going to drill down into what those different tiers are that we're looking at. And as we already noted, there are what are colloquially referred to as tiers 1, 2, and 3. Those are kind of terms of art. They don't, if you read the Renewable Energy Standard legislative text, you won't see the words tier 1, 2, or 3 appear anywhere. It's sort of a shorthand that's used. I'm going to use that shorthand here because I think it'll be, since it's sort of colloquially used that way, I think it'll be most useful. So tier 1, as Ben noted, tier 1 currently requires that 75% of the state's electricity be met with renewable energy by the year 2032. The goal here is to update tier 1 to move from 75% renewable energy to 100% renewable energy. So total renewable energy in the state is going to be 100%. That means there will be no electricity used in the state of Vermont that is not renewable. It's a huge goal, and an important one that we really should push for. We have to push for. Tier 2, which has been noted is currently 10% of total load, would come from smaller generation sources in the state of Vermont, like 5 megawatts or less in the state. That too will be grown. And the numbers there that we've been pushing for, we've initially pushed for numbers as high as 30%. It may be that we come in a bit below that, but in the realm of certainly doubling tier 2 to be at least 20% of total load. And so that would mean, multiple things. One, those smaller projects, those 5 megawatts or less, they're built in Vermont. Those are tremendously beneficial for many reasons, including you put that generation, the electricity generation, close to the demand where we actually use the electricity. And that means there are less miles of wire that the electricity needs to travel across. And so you reduce line loss. So you have a more efficient use of that electricity because you're not losing as much over the electricity lines as you would if the generation were farther away. You also increase resilience by bringing electricity generation sources closer to where it is used, and by distributing them around an area. You have a multifaceted approach and way to bring electricity to where it needs to be used. That's called distributed generation. And it has been shown to increase resilience in the face of intense storms, which we know are only intensifying more and more around the world, and here in Vermont, of course, because of climate change. And so increasing tier 2 in the way we've described here by building more clean renewable energy sources in the state of Vermont is going to have tremendous impacts, not only reducing our emissions, but also increasing our resilience and reducing line loss. And, and of course, it's going to bring more jobs and economic development to the state, because we're going to be building those generation sources here. And so there are also those co-benefits. So that's tier 2, big jump in tier 2 that we're talking about. In tier 3 that Ben mentioned, which is when you would basically switch from a fossil fuel use to an electric use, is typically how tier 3 operates historically in practice anyways. Generally, it's working well, and the idea is let's keep it going. And so tier 3 will largely remain the same moving forward. Now, this is some exciting stuff. Tiers 1, 2, and 3 are getting a new buddy. We are now contemplating a concept that we're referring to as tier 1A. So the idea here is it's new renewables, so not existing, but new renewables, and they can be built anywhere in the region. So Vermont is part of the New England region. So you could build these tier 1A new renewables in Vermont or anywhere else in the region. They would count anywhere. Likely, these will be larger projects, bigger than 5 megawatt hours. And that provides additional benefits. Those bigger projects, they have more capacity. They can produce more electricity, of course, which is extremely important, especially as load grows. But also with those bigger projects, you can utilize sort of economies of scale, and you can tend to get cheaper, more cost efficient electricity. And so the tier 1A, we're talking about basically growing the total amount of new renewables from anywhere in the region, but as required here in Vermont. And so when you add all this up, what you get is a 100% renewable energy standard that excludes nuclear power, new or expanded woody biomass, and no new flooding for large hydropower that would flood forests and other vegetation. And then we grow the total amount of new renewables by expanding tier 2 in-state distributed generation, and by requiring a new tier 1A, where we build new renewables anywhere in the region, in Vermont or elsewhere, that will likely tend to be larger projects, bigger offshore wind, big solar farms, big onshore wind projects. So that's sort of the summary of what we're thinking about as far as the nuts and bolts. There's certainly a lot more that can be said, especially about the co-benefits, the economic benefits, the growth in GDP, the relatively minor impacts on rates. There are a lot of really wonderful things to say on this point, but I will hold there and pass it back to Joey.
Thank you, Chase. Thank you, Ben, and thank you all for your questions. Keep them coming. We're going to aim to get to as many of them as possible. Some of your questions, like the one that Kathy just asked in the chat and then Ben answered, are, a little bit unknowable in this moment. The working group process has advanced, provided a really important foundation, has a lot of the sort of hoped for measures and buckets of new opportunities like tier 1A that Chase just described, but it's still a work in progress. So I guess what I would just note is that let's get to these questions, answer as many as we can, and then let you know that we're going to continue to want to lean on you as this conversation evolves over time. And to that point, I just want to let you know that what we anticipate in just a little bit more context, again, a lot of things answered and explored, a lot unresolved, still hugely promising. And it's because of the work of the work group, it's because of a lot of work at the local level, the grassroots, many of you who have pushed to get us to 100% renewables, and a lot of different stakeholders. But There's also been strong legislative support. Many lawmakers are really behind this initiative, including legislative leadership. The Speaker of the House in particular, this is a very important priority, which is exciting and imperative. But so we're going to need your help and the partnership of many others to push a good and final bill over the line. And just to note that we expect this conversation to start in the House when the legislature convenes, to be determined exactly when it will be taken up, but they convene on January 3rd. It will start likely in the Environment and Energy Committee, and the chair and vice chair of that committee also were members of the Renewable Energy Standard Working Group, also very committed to this effort. So big policy effort, big opportunity, a lot more work to do, and we'll see what we can answer in terms of the questions that you had with what we know now. Representative Phil Pouch asks, can we get to 20% in-state renewables without including wind? I'm happy to take a stab at that, but Chase, Ben?
Yes, we can. Yeah, we certainly can. Conservation Law Foundation, where I work, would very much like to see onshore wind play more of a role in Vermont, but it is not necessary for these res reforms to be effective. We can get the job done using primarily solar for tier 2.
Anything to add to that? I think that's accurate. It's great. Let's see. Can Vermont do more in-state renewables with the current PUC permitting process? I guess I would take a stab at that and then let others add a little bit more color. I would say that this process did not tackle the sort of the siting process and potential needs or updates to how we site renewable supplies here in the state of Vermont. That clearly is critical to making deployment possible. I think a new res will send a very clear message to the Public Utility Commission, but there will be more work to do. I think it's a really important question, Linda. And we have to figure out how we can bring more renewables online in a way that works for Vermont and Vermonters. But moving to a distributed generation system is going to mean that we're going to likely see more of where our energy comes from, and it's not in someone else's backyard. That is an environmental justice issue. So it's an important question, needs to be tackled, unresolved in this moment, but we got to make it work. Ben or Chase, do you have anything else to add?
I think the only thing I would add, which I heard you speak to, Joey, is just that although we're not tackling permitting reform here in this Renewable Energy Standard bill, that is an incredibly important topic because it does take a significant amount of time to get projects done, and it adds a meaningful amount of cost and uncertainty to the projects. And so although not being done here very soon, a hard look at permitting reform is going to be required. And I would just say that although that's very true in Vermont, which it is, it's also something that many other jurisdictions, states, and also at the national level in the US, that all those different jurisdictions are looking at, because it's becoming apparently clear that we need to be deploying renewables faster than we are. And one of the impediments to doing so is that sort of jurisdictional red tape, if you will. The permitting process has just become too onerous, too litigious, too expensive.
Yeah.
So more to come.
Point well taken. We're going to lean into you and that important work later, all of you. So another question, what about the effect on rates? Some of the opposition is really going to be around the costs of these changes. Ben, do you want to take a stab at that?
Sure. So the Department of Public Service has done some modeling, or rather they hired a consulting firm to do some modeling on what the potential cost of various options, various sort of scenarios from, no tier 1A, no new regional stuff, but like maybe 30% tier 2, 30% in state, all the way up to, 30% tier 1A, 30% in state, and like does biomass qualify? Do nukes qualify? So they have a bunch of different scenarios, like in a bunch of different potential rate impacts. And if you look at the couple that are sort of the closest to where it looks like the legislation is actually headed, it sort of falls maybe between the two of them. One had a rate that was 2% higher than the business as usual, like with no change to the renewable portfolio standard, the RES. And the other one, which is probably a little bit more than we're likely to see, was about 4% above business as usual. So historically, it's been very difficult to predict things like electric rates on into the future, especially when we're talking about renewables. There was some very good data presented to the working group that demonstrated very clearly here in Vermont, across the nation, and around the world, almost all the time when people try to predict the pace of renewable deployment going forward, they expect it to be lower than it really is. And when they try to predict the cost of renewables going forward, they almost always predict it to be higher than it really is. So we have that going for us in terms of the uncertainty of this kind of modeling. But if you take the modeling at face value, we're talking about something like a 3% rate increase above business as usual. Last thing I'll note is that doesn't mean they expect rates to go up 3% over the next dozen years or so. There would be a lot of rate increases happening just due to inflation and other things, sort of regardless of whether we touch this law or not. It would be that 3% extra to account for the massive increase that we're talking about in new renewables.
Thanks, Ben. And Chase, I'm going to take a stab at weaving a couple of questions together and punt it to you. There's a question related to if solar without wind power can get Vermont to our goals, what's the assumption about where the power comes from at night, where the wind often blows? There are questions related. And then a couple of questions about battery storage as part of that mix. And then also questions about offshore wind. Is that part of Tier 1A? Wouldn't that comply? So it feels like if you could speak to the wind component and the battery storage component, Chase, and how those fit in and what we could potentially anticipate and why.
Yeah, it's a good question. And it's a forward-looking question too, because although not yet really an issue in the state of Vermont, at least not across the whole state, when you look at the sort of state on average, the use of what are called intermittent renewables, things like wind and solar, can and has been shown in other jurisdictions like California to cause some issues when you have a significant amount of them online and you don't have other things like clean renewable base load powers or expanded transmission or good storage, energy storage. And so those things, energy storage, built out transmission, clean base load electricity, clean renewable base load electricity, those are things that are often referred to as flexibility measures. And so those are the types of things that we will have to contemplate down the road. And so, in reforming a renewable energy standard today, in the ways that we're contemplating, we are charting a path forward for the state to become 100% renewable and grow the total amount of new renewables that it will use. And so we're charting a path towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions and ensuring that all of the sectors of our economy have the opportunity to run on clean power, which is going to be critical. And so as we move forward, those questions of flexibility are going to become more important. And so things like the construction of offshore wind, which especially here in New England, it's an extremely windy place. There's a lot of potential off the coast of New England to generate electricity with wind, both at night and during the day. That will be really important to make that work. Building out transmission to bring that electricity to different parts of the state will be important, and also building out storage potential so that excess energy, let's say in the middle of the night, it's blowing stink out in the Gulf of Maine, being able to capture that energy and store it so that it can be utilized in another time will also be important. And so different projects and proposals are moving forward across the region. We have new transmission proposals moving forward. We have large storage proposals moving forward. We have large offshore and onshore wind proposals moving forward. And we have, the potential to build out new solar, larger solar projects. And so all of those things will matter, and potentially interconnecting New England with other parts of the region or other parts of the country to allow for the sharing of energy. So if the sun is shining in a different part of the country, but not here, being able to tap into that, all of those things, will matter, and we'll have to do them all. But the good news is we don't have to do them all right now. And this res doesn't need to solve all those problems. And it's also good news that some of those projects are moving forward sort of under federal purview at the international level through interconnections with our system. And so this is kind of a yes and, I guess, is the long and short. Yes, we need to do all those things, and we need to get this renewable energy standard done now, because it's a significant step forward for us as a state.
Thank you, Chase. Relatedly, but I mean, well, different. I think it's important to answer a question related to if Tier 1A is designed to bring new projects online, what's the thinking behind the eligibility being moved back to 2010? Ben, if you can tackle that one, that'd be great.
I absolutely can. And I will certainly be the first to admit that that is not intuitive. It doesn't really make a lot of sense sort of on the face of it, but if you look at the way energy markets work, actually it will work out the way we're talking about. So moving the date from 2015 to 2010 does absolutely maintain what we use, we call additionality, which basically means like if you take a policy action or if you do a thing at all, are you getting additional new renewables online or are you not? That's really the critical thing from a greenhouse gas standpoint. And so the way the sort of regional market works, if right now the renewable energy credits for those older systems like 2010, 2011 on up to 2015, where our current definition of new lies, those projects in Vermont where those RECs exist, they're being sold to utilities in Massachusetts or Connecticut to comply with their renewable portfolio standards, their electric utilities legal obligations. And so if we have a law on the books that enables Vermont utilities to, instead of selling those RECs out of state, keep them, retire them here to meet their legal obligations, what's going to happen is those other utilities in Massachusetts, Connecticut aren't going to have those RECs anymore. They're going to need to go find other RECs. And as a result, someone somewhere within the New England region is going to have to build new renewables. That would be true with the 2015 new renewable date that exists in law right now. It would be true with the 2010 date. It would be true if we had sort of a as passed, in 2024 date. The value from our perspective of moving the date back to 2010 is sort of twofold. One, 2010 is when Vermont policy really started driving renewables getting built in Vermont at some sort of scale. We had a standard offer project that was getting a lot of 1 and 2 megawatt solar farms built around the state. Wind projects were starting to get built based on Vermont policy. And so that's really the date where you're talking about, all the solar farms and wind farms you see around Vermont are pretty much universally on or after that date. And so having that 2010 date, one, ensures additionality based on how the regional market works, ensures that someone somewhere is going to have to build new renewables if we're keeping those RECs. Two, has the possibility of the renewable power that is being generated in Vermont, staying here or sort of coming home, so to speak, which seems great if that's reasonable and doable from a financial perspective. And three, it provides the utilities just a little bit of additional flexibility, which, all things being equal, would probably result in a very slightly lower rate impact, and which is always positive from our perspective if you can do that while maintaining just as much new renewable construction. So that's the thinking there, and I wish it weren't quite so counterintuitive, but that's just the way these laws work.
Thanks, Ben. And just because you mentioned it, there was a question related to the standard offer. What about reinstating it? Can you speak a little bit to how new procurement programs or the standard offer potential programs like that could fit in quickly?
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's something that we would have loved to bite off at the same time as an update to the Renewable Energy Standard. For folks who don't know, the standard offer in Vermont is a program that was created round about 2010. I think it might have been the 2009 legislative session, or maybe 2008. Anyway, round about then, was updated in 2012 and expanded. Essentially what it did was for solar projects, for any renewable project, though most of them have ended up being solar, up to 2.2 megawatts in size. It provided an avenue, a competitive bidding process for developers to get a fixed rate for all of the power they were selling for a substantial period of time, 20, 25 years from the construction date. And, essentially it was a way of providing certainty for developers so that they could get their projects financed, and certainty for utilities in terms of what they're going to be paying moving forward. It ultimately had 112.5 megawatts in capacity total. Not all of that's been built yet. Some of those contracts have been awarded to projects that are still sort of in the permitting process, haven't been built yet. But the program is now expired. There are no new contracts being bid for under that program. So from our perspective, having not necessarily that exact program, but something like it going forward makes a lot of sense. And what I expect will happen is in this legislative session, recognizing that there are probably going to be outstanding questions on net metering, on what a standard offer 2.0 could look like, these are both sort of procurement programs, ways to procure renewables. Other procurement programs could look like, I think there's a good chance there's going to be some sort of a study put into the Renewable Energy Standard bill, and that we would have to come back in a subsequent legislative session, probably 2025, to update, expand, or create new procurement programs to help meet the Renewable Energy Standard. Certainly, they wouldn't be account for all of the new renewables by any stretch in the Renewable Portfolio Standard, but would be a decent chunk of them.
Thanks, Ben. There was a question related to what are the key arguments against res reform, who's making them? And then there's also a question around sort of standard offer versus net metering. I guess I'm just wondering if Chase or Ben, you could speak to that, but also relatedly just speak to the sort of high likelihood that the update to the res is going to be very different for each utility to sort of cut down sort of cost impacts and to be uniquely construed to their particular circumstance. So I'm just curious if Chase or Ben, if you can speak to the sort of concerns around res reform, who's making them, why, and I think relatedly, a little bit more detail on the structure. Chase, you want to start, or Ben? Also happy to talk.
I'm happy to start, Ben. Yeah, if you could fill in the gaps or take over from me where I leave off, that'd be wonderful. I'll just very briefly speak to what are the arguments against. And I think that, there are different arguments that sort of different people or organizations make. And so rather than trying to, paint a picture that would describe each individual one, I'll note that sort of in broad brush strokes, opponents to res reform are similar to opponents to kind of any climate policy that we see. So folks who have in the past expressed views that verge on what some reasonable-minded people might describe as sort of climate denialism, although we're not seeing people step forward and say that expressly here, but similar groups, similar folks are sort of stepping forward now who've said things like that in the past, and are just sort of generally raising concerns about res reform now. So similar faces, I guess, is what I'm really trying to say. Sort of the types of arguments that often are brought forward can be even if Vermont reduces all of its emissions, what is that really going to do in the big picture? Which one might also say of a state like California, which is quite large, or a country like France. If just one jurisdiction were to act, how is that really going to solve the climate crisis? And I think, there are multiple ways to talk about that. The Energy Action Network has demonstrated how Vermonters' emissions are extremely high on a per capita basis when compared with folks who live in other parts of New England and sort of the northeastern region. We emit more, as individuals here in Vermont than many other folks do. And so one could argue we have an outsized obligation to reduce our emissions because right now we're creating more, per person. I think another sort of way to look at it, and one that I personally find extraordinarily compelling, is we're all in this together, as a species, as a planet. We have to get this done. We have a limited number of years left to reduce greenhouse gas emissions significantly enough to avoid 1.5 degrees Celsius increase, or higher than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And so frankly, we all need to be rowing, pulling on all of our oars in the same direction, and bringing all of our various boats to the same destination. So every jurisdiction, every state, every country, every county, every city, every household needs to be doing what it can do. And so that may sound a bit Pollyanna, but frankly, I think that really is where we're at. We all need to act. So we have a moral responsibility, if you will, and as a state to act. And we need to do our part. We have done our part to cause the climate crisis. And so now it's, we've made this mess, we've contributed to this mess. And so now we need to do our part to clean it up.
Yeah, Ben, do you want to?
Let me just very briefly, and then I'm unfortunately going to need to jump a little bit before the hour. One thing that Joey asked about that I think is really important to emphasize is the kind of outline that we went through towards the top of the hour. I think is the outline of what's going to apply to a number of the utilities. I think some of the pace of deployment, the ramp rates, as it were, the exact percentage of new renewables and exactly what year that occurs in will probably vary from utility to utility a little bit, as we're looking at the legislation developing. And then there are several utilities that currently have some exemptions from parts of the Renewable Energy Standard based on the fact that they were 100% renewable prior to the enactment of the first Renewable Energy Standard in 2015. And so for those utilities, what we are pushing for and been discussing in the working group is a requirement that really would be based mostly around their load growth, their new load as we electrify, coming primarily from new renewables. The general principle that we talked about a lot in the working group is just needing to look at the context for each individual utility as the working group and now the legislature are designing the Renewable Energy Standard as applies to each one, and not trying to have some sort of one size fits all that fits some utilities very well and other utilities not so well. So we're expecting to see some differences, and I just want to be clear with everyone here that from our perspective is not a bad thing, even if it does mean some utilities are moving towards new renewables faster than others. It's merely a recognition that in Vermont we have a wide variety of utilities, from small municipal utilities with just a few hundred customers, all the way up to Green Mountain Power, which provides about 2/3 of the electricity, 3/4 if you include Global Foundries, which is currently a GMP customer but becoming its own utility. So it's just an important piece of context to have. And thank you everyone for joining. I think we might have time for one or two more questions, but I have to unfortunately jump. I'm looking forward to working with you all this legislative session.
Thanks, Ben. Really quickly, Chase, there's a question about if no new forest flooding, how will hydro expand? Can you take that quickly and then?
Sure. So there are different types of hydro. Of course, there are low impact. There's low impact hydro, or typically folks refer to that as run of river. which extreme shorthand would be, it doesn't require you to flood a reservoir and kill a whole bunch of trees that are growing in that area. And so that is fine hydro. There are other implications that need to be thought through, like what are the impacts on water quality, on aquatic species that could be impacted by the dam, and things like that, which should be looked at and must be looked at under other legal provisions, the Clean Water Act, for example. But from a climate perspective, that type of low impact run-of-river hydro is good stuff. And so to the extent there is potential to bring more of that on, that could be something that could be looked at. As far as flooding forests to create hydroelectric power, that is, from a climate perspective, pretty harmful. Because when you flood those forests, you kill the trees. They are currently storing a tremendous amount of carbon. And as they grow, they store more and more. They sequester carbon that would otherwise be in the atmosphere. But when you flood them, you lose that storage benefit, that sequestration benefit, and you actually create a net emitter. When forests are flooded, they decompose, they produce methane, an extremely potent greenhouse gas, and carbon dioxide, sort of like the most prominent greenhouse gas. And so we need to not let that happen. So when we talk about not taking electricity from dams that would cause new flooding, from a climate perspective, that's why, because those new dams produce a lot of really bad greenhouse gas emissions. And also from an environmental justice perspective, because many of those dams that are currently being built in the Hydro-Quebec area are flooding indigenous lands and displacing First Nations people, and frankly poisoning First Nations people because of mercury poisoning. And so there are multiple very good reasons why we shouldn't be flooding more lands up in Canada to produce more hydroelectric power. So the idea is basically don't take power from those. Any type of new flooding in that space is a bad deal, and we shouldn't do it.
Thank you, Chase, and thank you, everyone. And there are just a couple more questions, but I'm going to end with, sort of Linda's, which is talking about how does this tamp down on, like, as you described it, rec arbitrage. I just would say that this maintains generally the current framework for utilities, but really is focused on bringing in and building in-state and in-region new renewable resources. So really tamping down on and bringing, as Ben said it, bringing that clean energy back home or requiring someone else to build new renewables elsewhere, so that we're really talking about new, additional, clean, renewable resources coming online, onto the grid, into our portfolios, into our lives, doing our part on climate, cutting costs, many public health benefits, so many different values that we want to lean into. So we are at the top of the hour. We are grateful for your time, underscoring many details to be figured out. The legislative session will commence after the holidays, where I hope you and yours get some R&R. Maybe there will be snow, underscoring the need for us to do our part on the climate crisis. So please know we're going to need you in this effort. We'll look to answer more questions probably at an ensuing webinar at some point soon. And please stay committed. Enjoy this sunny day, and thanks to everyone for coming, and Chase and Ben for your time and expertise. Have a great day, everyone.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you.